Listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On August 2nd, 1963, 4-year-old Bobby Panknin, along with his 2 older brothers and his 2 parents, headed off to a camping resort on Deep Lake in Washington state. The following day, Mrs. Panknin, whose name was Edna, decides she wants to take her 3 sons down a logging road that was right behind their campsite that she had heard fed out to this beautiful little waterfall that she thought her sons would like to see. Edna gets the boys ready, she says bye to Mr. Panknin, and then she and her sons take off down this logging road. And as soon as she's on the road, it occurs to her that it's totally overgrown, the grass is really high, it's rocky and bumpy, and she's thinking to herself, there's no way any vehicle is getting down this road, and probably there's been no vehicles on this road for a very long time. This is a very isolated place on this campsite. So they walk for a little ways on this overgrown logging road until they see there's a turnoff that leads down to the water and this little waterfall. And so right away she saw there was all this brush they were going to need to walk through, and the ground looked pretty rough. And Bobby, her youngest, the 4-year-old, he didn't have shoes on. He was going through a phase where he refused to wear shoes. And so it hadn't really mattered the entire duration of walking up the road, but it seemed like this might be too much for him to walk on. And so she told Bobby to wait on the road, and she told her other son, Jimmy, the 6-year-old, to wait next to him. Those two would stay on the road together while she and Bill, the 10-year-old, would go past the brush, go down to the water, check it out for a couple of minutes, and then she would come back, she would pick up Bobby, and Jimmy would come along, and then they would go down and look at the water, and then they would leave. Bobby didn't seem to mind, so he just sat on the road, and Jimmy was a little bit frustrated that he couldn't go with the first group, but he sat down too, and Bill and Edna took off past this brush down to the water. Now the distance between where Bill and Edna and where Bobby and Jimmy were was only about 10 feet. There was just this brush right in the middle of them that did obscure their view. They could not see each other, but they are very close to each other. And so Jimmy is sitting next to Bobby, and he's getting increasingly more and more restless. He wants to go down and look at the waterfall. He wants to be down there with his older brother and his mom. And so at some point he just can't take it anymore. And Jimmy does something that to this day he regrets every single day. And that is he got up and left his brother. He went through the brush down to where Bill and Edna were. And as soon as Edna saw him, she was mad at him and she goes, "What? You left Bobby up there? Come on." And so they turned around after about 60 seconds and went right back up. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. And at first, they're not like, oh my goodness, someone's abducted Bobby, because there's no one on this road. They'd come up here and recognize that it's very remote, it's isolated, there's no cars that come through here, they hadn't heard anything. And so their first instinct was, okay, he probably got up, and is behind a tree, or he walked down the hill over here, or he's nearby. And so they're yelling for him, they're walking around, and no one's panicking yet. In fact, really, Edna was just annoyed with Jimmy that he had left, Bobby, and that he's to blame right now, but it's just an inconvenience at this point. But after a couple of minutes, when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked, and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other 2 sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense because, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other 2 boys and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Panknin and they hailed the police, and very quickly, a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Edna and the other 2 boys about, what did you hear? You had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you, and he was within earshot of you, certainly. What did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal? Did you hear anybody talking? And Edna and the other 2 boys, they swore that they heard nothing, that they're just as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a good starting point of where Bobby could have gone. And in that area, there wasn't any, steep drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. It'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions, hoping they would, find a piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After 3 days of searching that yielded nothing, they finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby had gone missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles. And it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent. And it stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing. And it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. That there's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog. And again, the dog just keeps tracking to this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, "We have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted." And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest, and he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, if someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby, one, and there wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family. And two, they would need to be very strong and quick and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and then evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear-sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there, and there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there's no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there was no drag marks, there was no blood, and why he's just gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that family. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept in so fast that no one heard it, no one saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something to him. And whatever it did, it probably wasn't good.
Our next story is called M Cave.
In 2014, Kenny Veach was an avid long-distance hiker that spent lots of his time hiking around the Mojave Desert in search of caves and abandoned mine shafts to go check out. Sometimes he'd bring his girlfriend with him, but most of the time he was on his own and he would stay out for a couple of days at a time. Kenny was constantly on YouTube watching hiking videos and anything to do with the Mojave Desert. And Kenny was a regular commenter on all of those types of videos. In June of 2014, Kenny must have watched this video called Son of an Area 51 Technician because he had left this comment where he was telling the community that had watched this video that he had had a very strange thing happen to him when he was out hiking near Area 51. For those that don't know what Area 51 is, it's a highly confidential United States Air Force installation that is frequently looped into alien conspiracy theories. Kenny goes on to describe this strange event, and he said he found this cave entrance on the side of this mountain that was shaped like an uppercase M. As Kenny walks up to enter this M-shaped cave, he said his body started to vibrate and it stopped him in his tracks. And he said he didn't know what it was, but as he walked closer and closer, his body just continued to vibrate to the point where he said he just had to turn around and leave. That he knew something was wrong with this cave and he could not go inside. And so he said he turned around and he left. His comment got a lot of traction on this video, and a lot of people jumped on and were like, well, I don't really believe you, one, but if that is true, you gotta go back. You gotta go back there and explore it. You gotta document this. Whatever this is, we want to know what it is. They were basically egging him on to go back and check it out. Kenny responded to his critics and said, I'm telling you the truth. I know what I saw. This cave was different. I go out in the desert all the time looking for caves, and I go in them. That's what I do. This one was different, and that's why I didn't go in it. But people just kept egging him on to go back and check it out and to film it, show documentation of this thing. And so finally he agrees. A couple of months later, Kenny goes back out to the Mojave Desert with his camera, and he films himself looking for the M cave. But he can't find it, so the video's kind of a bust. He still uploads it to YouTube, and he tells everyone that he's gonna go back out again. He knows where it is, he's fairly confident that he can get to it again, but he just needs to go out a third time to go look for it. Over the course of the next month, in the comment section of that video, people are encouraging Kenny and saying, go out there, go find it, we're so excited. One commenter was not so encouraging. Their name was Lemmy Killmeister, and they wrote on his video, do not go to M Cave. If you go in, you won't be able to get out again. Kenny wrote back, what do you mean? And Lemmy Killmeister didn't respond and subsequently vanished from YouTube. Kenny brushes this off, and on November 10th, 2014, he heads back out once again to try to find M Cave. On November 14th, when he had not returned and his girlfriend had not heard from him and couldn't get in touch with him, she called the police. The police launched this massive search for Kenny. They knew roughly where he was going to be because he had documented it so aggressively on his YouTube channel, and so they search in that area, and after about a week they find his cell phone, and it was laying outside of an abandoned mine shaft. Now, immediately, searchers think, well, he must have fallen into this mine shaft that was almost a vertical mine shaft. He must have fallen in there to his death. So they get a camera, and they feed it down into this mine shaft, and there's no one in there. And very clearly, no one had been down this mine shaft in a very long time. Certainly not Kenny. There were no tracks around where his phone was located, so no animal tracks or people tracks. And the phone didn't have blood on it or scratches on it. It was just sitting there with no new information. Beyond the cell phone, they had nothing else to go on, and eventually the search was terminated. Kenny never turned up. He was just gone after that. While it's pretty easy for people to chalk up this whole M Cave thing as total nonsense and that they believe all that happened is Kenny went out into the wilderness of the Mojave Desert and ultimately got lost and died, and that's fair, I do want to offer up one thing about his description of being near the cave that first time he saw it. He described his body vibrating to the point where he couldn't go any further and he had to turn around and leave. The United States military uses these things called access denial systems around their highly classified installations. Anywhere where you cannot risk someone getting in, like a fence isn't good enough, they use these machines that fire beams at people that get too close. They're non-lethal, but it's like being thrust inside of a microwave. You feel hot and really uncomfortable, and you turn around and you get the heck out of there. The fact that Kenny was right near Area 51, a highly confidential area, regardless of alien conspiracies, it's a known highly confidential base. And he's discovering this strange cave entrance that doesn't look like other cave entrances, and he's walking up to it describing basically what it feels like to be hit with an access denial system. It makes you wonder, did he discover some secret entrance to some secret base? Or is this a bunch of crap and he just got lost in the desert and died? We don't know. But what we do know is that his search for M Cave probably ended his life.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Mine is Mine. On an early morning in August of 1931, an 86-year-old man carrying a massive backpack limped into a supply store in the tiny town of Alvin, British Columbia, Canada. This man's name was Robert Brown, but everyone knew him as Volcanic, because decades earlier he had discovered a gold mine in Volcanic City, Canada. Volcanic had actually made his living as a gold prospector, and he had been so good at it that he had been able to retire early. And so these days, as an 86-year-old man, he pretty much got to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And so inside of this supply store, the young man at the cash register smiled at Volcanic and offered to let him keep his backpack at the front of the store while Volcanic shopped. And Volcanic kind of scowled back at him. I mean, he took offense to this. He knew how he must look to this clerk. I mean, Volcanic was old, short, super skinny, and he dragged his left foot when he walked. And so he figured, this kid must think he's weak, and Volcanic hated that. He did not think he was weak. And so he said to the guy, "No, I can carry my bag myself, thank you very much." Then, to show the clerk there was more to him than met the eye, Volcanic flashed this big grin, revealing this gaudy, enormous set of gold teeth that he had bought when he had struck it rich in Volcanic City. And after seeing these ridiculous gold teeth, the clerk looked very taken aback, which was exactly what Volcanic wanted. Satisfied, Volcanic limped past the cash register and the clerk towards the back of the store, where he picked up some cooking supplies, ammo for his shotgun, and a pen to write in his journal. And then he took everything up front to check out. Volcanic watched as the clerk furrowed his brow as he rang up the items, clearly trying to make sense of what Volcanic was up to. He asked Volcanic if he was going camping by the Pit River that ran through town. But Volcanic said no, he was going to the Pit River first, but he was going to hike all the way along the Pit River, go through the mountains to another body of water called Stave Lake. And before the clerk could ask any questions, Volcanic said he was going there because there was a hidden gold mine he was going to explore. And at this, Volcanic watched with delight as the clerk's eyes got wide. Volcanic knew most people, especially in this area, thought this gold mine was a total myth. And sure enough, when the clerk recovered from his surprise, he said to Volcanic, hey, you really ought to reconsider going there. The clerk said he had seen plenty of people come through his shop on the way out to go try to find this mine, but nobody ever came back saying they had found it. In fact, he said that some of these people didn't come back at all. At least 2 people had died because the hike to Stave Lake was miles and miles through extremely dangerous terrain. Volcanic waited until the clerk was done lecturing him, and then he leaned over the counter and he whispered to the kid that he was different. He had a secret that would allow him and only him to find that mine successfully. And when he did, he would come back to the store and he would lay the gold down right on the counter just to prove it to him. Then Volcanic left a handful of cash on the counter, he gathered up his supplies, flashed one more gold-toothed smile, and then made his way out the door. A few hours later, Volcanic hiked uphill along the rocky banks of the Pit River. He'd only covered about 5 miles so far, because after all, he was 86 with a bum left foot, and so he moved pretty slowly these days. But even still, only 5 miles into the journey, he already felt totally cut off from civilization. The Pit River was about 1,000 feet across, and it was surrounded on either side by a thick forest. Volcanic was hiking parallel with the river, with the water on his right and the trees on his left. It was a stark and isolated setting that would make most people feel small and vulnerable. But after so many years working as a gold prospector, Volcanic was very accustomed to being out in the wilderness all by himself, so this felt normal. Now, of course, decades had passed since the last time Volcanic was a gold prospector, but even now, at his old age, he still felt like he was the skilled outdoorsman he once was. Volcanic kept on hiking uphill, staying close to the shore's edge, until the sun began to set. And by that point, the trees on the left had begun to thin out, and Volcanic was finally able to see kind of far out beyond in the direction he was going. And he saw off in the distance there were all these mountains. And as soon as he could see these mountains, he pulled out his journal, and he flipped to the last page, and he studied the page, and then looked at the mountains, and he smiled. It was going to take weeks to reach the gold mine, but he knew he was going the right way. Because on that last page of his journal was a map. This map was the secret that Volcanic had told the store clerk about. It was the thing that was going to allow Volcanic to reach that gold mine where so many others had not. Volcanic had actually drawn the map himself several years ago. Back then, he'd been panning for gold in northern British Columbia when he had run into this indigenous woman in the forest. And this woman was deathly ill, and so out of the kindness of his heart, Volcanic had given this woman some healing herbs and then stayed with her for days until she was nursed back to health. And this woman had been so grateful to Volcanic that she had told him a secret. She told him that the legendary gold mine out near Stave Lake was absolutely real. And she said she knew this because her father was friends with the guy who discovered it. The man's name was Slumac, and she said he would go into the wilderness for days at a time, and then when he came back home, he'd come bearing these huge gold nuggets as big as chicken eggs. And not only did this woman tell Volcanic about this mine, she gave him directions to it. And so as she did, Volcanic took notes in his journal and then used those directions to construct the map. However, before Volcanic parted ways with this woman, she gave him a warning. Right before he died, she said Slumac put a curse on the mine. And so now, if anybody tried to reach the mine, the forest itself would stop them. And so now, standing in a clearing beside the Pit River, Volcanic thought back to that warning. He wasn't afraid of what she said, but just to be safe, he figured he would spend as little time as possible in the forest, and any time he needed to pitch his tent along this journey to the mine, he would do so as far away from the tree line as he could. This was actually Volcanic's second attempt at trying to reach this gold mine. 5 years earlier, he had attempted this exact same hike. On that attempt, despite Volcanic reaching the shores of Stave Lake, which apparently was right near the entrance to this gold mine, he had to stop because he got a severe case of frostbite on his left foot. That frostbite had caused 3 of his toes to die and rot, and so Volcanic had to amputate all 3 of them with his pocket knife, right there out in the wild, no anesthetic, nothing. And so this is why Volcanic had to turn around on that attempt, and it's why he now walked with a limp. And Volcanic had to admit that the fact that he had been forced to literally cut off his own toes did make it seem like he had become a victim of Slumac's curse. But he also knew that it didn't take a curse to make the Canadian wilderness dangerous. He just should have worn thicker socks. Just then, Volcanic heard a twig snap somewhere outside of his campsite in the darkness. And so instinctively he shot up, he grabbed a shotgun, and he turned towards the sound, half expecting a bear to come charging out of the woods. But after standing there for several minutes, nothing came out of the forest, and eventually all Volcanic could hear was the gentle sound of his fire and the river. The forest was totally still. As his heartbeat slowed down, Volcanic told himself that, the sound he heard must have just been a rabbit running through the forest, nothing to worry about. And so he lowered his gun and steadied his breathing, and he looked at his fire and he gave half a thought to just leaving his campfire burning, just in case he heard something else, he'd have some light to go out and see what it was. But he thought he was being kind of paranoid, and so he grabbed some water and put out the fire, engulfing him in darkness, and then he climbed into his tent and fell asleep. The next morning, Volcanic got up at sunrise, packed up his tent and his camping gear, and then hiked all day long. And he did this day in and day out, dragging his left foot behind him for over a month. Volcanic knew he was moving much slower than a younger, healthier man would. Some days, he could barely travel a mile before feeling so exhausted that he would have to stop. But despite becoming skinnier and more ragged by the day, Volcanic kept on hiking. And eventually, after going all the way down the Pit River and crossing through the mountains, he finally arrived at the shore of Stave Lake, the same place he'd been when he'd had to amputate his own toes. But this time, he was able to keep on going. Volcanic hiked all the way to the opposite side of Stave Lake, and he came to a stop to take in the view. Surrounding the lake were all these huge rolling mountains, and in one spot, Volcanic noticed the mountains dipped down and formed a natural bowl in the earth that was filled with this gorgeous bluish-white ice. Now, even though Volcanic had never been to this place before, he knew instinctively that that had to be Stave Glacier. And this glacier meant everything to Volcanic because it was the last major landmark on his map on the way to this mine. According to his map, the entrance to the gold mine was located on the side of a mountain not far from the glacier. Now, Volcanic wanted to keep pushing forward and try to get to this entrance as soon as possible. He was excited, but the sun was starting to go down, and he knew if he kept on going at night, the risk of injury was quite high. He could slip and fall. And remember, it had taken Volcanic over a month to hike into this location. He is way away from civilization, and so if he gets hurt, nobody's coming to help him. And so he decided he would stop and make camp that night. He pitched his tent well away from the tree line, he ate some beef jerky and biscuits, and then he crawled into his sleeping bag to try to go to sleep. But he couldn't. He was too excited about this mine. He was so close. And so he laid there restlessly for hours, listening to the sound of the wind pick up outside. Now, normally, the sound of the wind would help Volcanic fall asleep. But tonight, it was not helping. It was actually making him feel really uneasy. The wind was loud and fast howling across the lake, and that's when Volcanic noticed that despite all the noise outside, when he looked at the fabric of his tent, it wasn't moving with the wind. It was totally stationary. And so Volcanic sat up and he opened up the flap of his tent and looked outside, and the second he did, it got even louder, the howling wind, but he couldn't feel any wind blowing. And so he struck a match and he held it out in front of his tent, and the flame didn't even flicker, again, despite all this crazy howling sounds. And that's when he realized there was no wind. And so feeling totally unsettled, Volcanic closed the flap of his tent, got back in his sleeping bag, clutching his gun, listening to this horrifying sound outside that he couldn't make any sense of. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sound just went away. By this point, Volcanic was so anxious just to leave and go to this mine that he didn't eat any breakfast. He just grabbed his journal, tore the map out of the last page, tucked it in his back pocket, and he started hiking. He still felt very uneasy about the phantom wind he had heard all night long, but now his sole focus was on this mine. He knew that if he could find it, he would not only have infinite riches, but he would also go down in history as like the greatest gold prospector ever. And on top of that, on the way back out again, he could stop at that supply store and drop some gold on the counter and rub it in that clerk's face, just like he said he would. Volcanic made his way first towards the glacier and then up the side of a mountain. He dodged tree limbs and climbed over boulders, all the while dragging his left foot on the ground. And then finally, up ahead, he saw this dark hole on the side of a mountain, and it looked like the entrance to a cave. Now, Volcanic could not see very far into that cave, but he was certain the gold mine had to be inside of there. And so with a rush of excitement, he made his way up to the dark entryway and he stepped inside. Two months later, on November 2nd, 1931, that store clerk back in Alvin looked out the front window of his store and watched the snow begin to fall. A blizzard was coming in, and all this clerk could think about was that strange old man with the gold teeth who had wandered off into the wilderness 3 months earlier. Now, the old man had told the clerk that he would stop by the store on his way out to prove he had found the gold. However, the man had not returned. And so the clerk wasn't sure if that was because, he was too embarrassed because he hadn't found the mine, or if maybe he had gotten stuck out in the wilderness. But either way, the clerk just had a bad feeling that, something bad could have happened to that guy. And so just to play it safe, the clerk grabbed his jacket, he left the store, and he went to go find the local game warden to tell him what was going on. Three weeks later, that same game warden trudged through knee-high snow at the edge of Stave Lake. Even though he and his search party were much younger and healthier than Volcanic, it had still taken them weeks to arrive here, mostly because of the blizzard. But in all the time it took hiking to this location, they had not found a single trace of Volcanic. The warden was beginning to wonder if this was pointless, if they should just turn around and head back. That's when he looked up and he noticed the glacier on the far end of the lake. And in the snow near that glacier was this little pop of color. The warden pointed it out to his men, and they all began running towards it, and as they got closer, they realized what this thing was a tent that had collapsed under the snow. And then once they actually reached the tent, they shoveled off all the snow and sort of popped it back up, and they looked inside. But Volcanic was not in there. Instead, they found an empty sleeping bag, they found some cooking supplies, a shotgun, some ammo, and a journal that's last page was missing. But there was also one more thing that was inside of this tent. On the floor, right near the opening flap of this tent, was a glass jar. The warden picked it up, and he looked inside, and he gasped. Volcanic Brown was never seen again, and no explanation for what happened to him was ever uncovered. His body was never found, and there were no signs of struggle anywhere in or near his campsite. But the contents of that glass jar that was found inside of the tent proved that either Slumac's gold mine or Slumac's curse was real. There are two slightly different versions of what people believe was found inside of that jar. The first is that the jar was filled with huge nuggets of raw gold. If this is true, it means the gold mine did exist, and Volcanic must have found it before he disappeared. But the second version of what people say was found in that jar has a much darker meaning. In that version, when the warden held up that jar, he did see gold inside, but it was not gold from the mine. Instead, it was Volcanic's solid gold teeth. Almost 100 years have passed since Volcanic went missing, and still to this day, no one has ever successfully found the mine and lived to tell the tale. But to this day, people still keep looking for it, and so far, at least 33 people have either died or disappeared in search of it.
In 1899, Alan Atadero was staying in the Comanche wilderness in northern Colorado with his two kids. He had his daughter, who was 6 years old, her name was Jocelyn, and his son, Jared, who was 3 at the time. They were staying at the Poudre River Resort, which Alan actually owned. He co-owned it with his identical twin brother, and Alan was up there to prepare the resort for winter. Alan had recently divorced from his wife and joined a Christian singles group, and somehow it came up that some people in the singles group asked if they could stay at the Poudre River Resort with Alan and help him prepare the resort for winter in exchange for free lodging so they could have a little vacation. Alan said that was great because he really needed the help. As soon as they got up there, 11 of the Christian singles members were talking about going to the nearby state fish hatchery. Jared and Jocelyn had heard about this and were really eager to go with them, and they asked their father, Alan, if that would be okay. Alan felt comfortable with Jocelyn, his 6-year-old, going, but was reluctant to send Jared because he was 3, was worried that, he would lag behind, and was just generally reluctant to send his youngest. But Jared really wanted to go, and Jared was saying, well, you let Jocelyn go, I want to go. Alan, maybe against his better judgment, said, yep, you can take Jared. Jared hated wearing shoes. Jared said, can I leave my shoes? And Alan said, no, you got to bring your shoes. And Jared really put up a fight. He didn't want to wear his shoes. Alan said, okay, put on your shoes, we just won't tie them. That's the compromise they made. Put on his shoes, didn't tie them, and he was off. So the Christian singles group of 11 plus Jocelyn and Jared take off towards the state fish hatchery. But without asking for Alan's consent, instead of going to the state fish hatchery, they decided to head over to the Big South Trail, which was about 15 miles west of the resort where Alan was. They get to the beginning of this trail, which is an 11-mile, very rugged trail. Narrow path, it's fairly steep. You're going up almost 10,000 feet of elevation. This was a rugged hike. This was not a beginner's hike. Now, we don't know exactly what the timeline is here, but we know that Jared and Jocelyn were definitely with the Christian singles group when they began this hike, because at some point the Christian singles broke into like a fast group and a slow group. And during that time, when they kind of separated into 2 groups, Jared had somehow run ahead of one of the groups and had come in contact with these 2 fishermen that were on the Big South Trail. The Big South Trail was located near a world-class fly fishing area, and these 2 men were fly fishing. And they saw Jared, and they also saw these 2 groups of people making this climb on this trail, and they, the fishermen, assumed that he had to be with them. Jared walked up to them and said, hey, have you seen any bears in the area? And they said, no. And Jared just skipped away. It's believed that the 2 fishermen that saw Jared on the trail were the last 2 people to see Jared alive. At some point shortly after Jared has made contact with these 2 fishermen, the singles group realizes they've lost track of Jared. They have Jocelyn, but they've lost sight of Jared. And so there's an immediate search of the area. They're yelling out to Jared. And after about an hour, they haven't found him. However, one of the Christian singles members hears a scream. It was not a scream of someone getting attacked, but rather it was way off, off the trail. It sounded like a child who they would describe the scream as sounding gleeful, like they were playing with someone, like they were playing tag or hide and seek with someone. They tried to make it over to that area, but they couldn't locate where the sound was coming from. And despite yelling out for Jared constantly, they could never locate him. While the search is going on, one of the members leaves and goes back to the resort to break the news to Alan, Jared's father. Alan immediately gets in his car. He's yelling, "You lost my baby." And he drives over to the Big South Trail. Now, Alan just assumed he'd be able to get out and just charge around like a maniac, yelling for his son, and he would find him. But he quickly realizes that this is a really rugged and very dense area. It's going to be almost impossible for he alone to search and find his son. He calls authorities, and authorities show up, and they launch this massive search. Now, the search and rescue crew, when they showed up, they were very confident that they were going to find Jared. They felt like they had a really good sense of where he was, that it would have been very difficult for him to go anywhere. They had the fishermen saying they'd seen him. They had one of the members who heard a scream in a specific area. They've done these searches, unfortunately, many times, and most times they find the child hiding somewhere, crying somewhere, but they're unhurt. By the next day, after a full 24 hours of searching, when they haven't found anything, that's when the search and rescue team began to realize that more than likely this was not going to be a successful search. Now, the search would go on for a week. It was a very chaotic search. The case had made national headlines, and so people were converging on this area in Colorado just to kind of be a witness to this case. You had volunteers showing up left and right to help search, and police had to actually keep them from going into the area because they didn't want to clutter up the search area. So it's just very chaotic. And also during this time, a helicopter crashed that was searching for Jared. Luckily, no one perished in that crash, but it was just this crazy search for about a week, and they don't find anything. A week after the search had begun, they officially called it off, and the going theory was that Jared had most likely been attacked by a mountain lion. 4 years go by, and 2 hikers were in the same area on the Big South Trail, walking up the trail, and they decide when they got to this one section near where Jared went missing, there was this really steep, rocky climb that was not part of the trail. But if you wanted to, and you were adventurous and athletic enough, it's feasible that you could crawl up, hands and knees all the way up this rocky face and you could get to this rocky outcropping where you'd have this great view looking down over the canyon. And so these two hikers decide to do that. So they start climbing up this rocky slope that they would say is a treacherous climb. And actually David Paulides, the man behind the Missing 411 project, does a video where he climbs up that rocky face and it looks very steep and difficult to navigate. So these two hikers make it to this outcropping. And the first thing they notice is a pair of brand new children's sneakers, white sneakers. And as soon as they see it, they think, oh, I guess a family must be up here, and they let their kid take their shoes off. And so they're looking around for the family that must have just been adventurous and climbed up here, but there's no one up there, and it's a small area. And they're like, huh, what are these shoes doing up here? Then they found bits of Jared's clothing near the shoes. His pants were found turned inside out, very completely turned inside out. His sweatshirt was more or less intact. Both the sweatshirt and the pants had all the signs of being out in the open for 4 years with, weather hitting hard and being exposed to the elements. They were frayed and tattered. The shoes had also apparently been out in the elements for 4 years, but showed almost no wear and tear. The hikers that found them literally thought they were brand new shoes. And then around that area, they also located one of Jared's teeth, and they found a bone that belonged to Jared as well. So it really begs the question, how did Jared get up nearly 550 feet above the trail over extremely difficult to navigate terrain? And why were his shoes completely unweathered after 4 years of being out in the elements? And why were his shoes up there in the first place? They were untied on his feet. He certainly would not have been able to navigate the terrain up there even with his shoes laced. But if he had been navigating that terrain, he almost certainly would have lost his shoes in the process. So we don't know what actually led to Jared's demise. However, we do know that somehow he was found, his remains were found in an area that was effectively inaccessible to him. In July of 1938, the Beilharz family decided to go camping deep in the Rocky Mountains. Now, the Beilharz family was a huge family. They had 10 kids, including Alfred, who was a 4-year-old boy. One of the days they were camping, they decided to go on a hike to a great fishing spot. And so they got in this big line with all 10 kids and the parents, and they start walking, and Alfred was far back in that line. And at some point he must have wandered off or got separated, and at some point the family noticed. There was an immediate preliminary search, and there's a bunch of them. They're calling out to their son, their brother. After this initial search results in nothing, one of the members of the family alerts authorities, and it would launch a 10-day search. When the authorities showed up, they were operating under the assumption that Alfred must have fallen into the river and drowned. And so their efforts went into not only damming the river to stop anything going through, but they also began raking the river as well to find any of Alfred's remains. When the raking of the river and the damming of the river turned up nothing, the authorities decided to bring in some bloodhounds from a nearby state penitentiary to try to pick up his scent and find him. And so they bring the bloodhounds over to where he went missing, and right away they pick up his scent. And then, somewhat paradoxically, instead of going down to the river where all the authorities assume that's where he must have gone, the dogs turned and went up this near sheer cliff. They went over 500 feet uphill to this clearing on the mountain, this little plateau on the mountain, and then they just laid down as if they had found him. The authorities assumed this was an anomaly. There's no way this child could have gotten up nearly 500 feet to that plateau, not to mention there was no sign of the child up there anyways. So they just assumed that the dogs must be wrong. So they sent those dogs back and got new bloodhounds to do the same test. And so they brought the new bloodhounds to the point where Alfred had vanished, and they did the same thing. They didn't go down to the river. They followed the exact same trail all the way up, nearly 500 feet up to that plateau where they laid down to signify this is where the scent ends. And it was baffling because there was nothing up there to indicate that he was there or ever was there. But now you have two groups of bloodhounds that did the same thing. You can't say his scent wasn't up there because the dogs found it twice. So at the same time this search is going on, a report came in from another hiker that was about 6 miles away, less than 24 hours after he had gone missing. And the report from this hiker was he was sitting down to take a rest, and he looked up towards this mountain. And about 500 feet up, he saw a little rocky outcropping, and a boy walked out to the edge and looked down at him. And the man looked up like, how did the boy get up there? And the child let out a shrill shrieking sound before something that was out of view pulled him backwards, and then he was never seen again. And so he reported it, and the authorities dismissed it, because how could a 4-year-old boy have moved 6 miles away and 500 feet up to this rocky outcropping? However, authorities did send a team to go search that area where this hiker had seen this child, and there was nothing there. So you have these 2 separate locations, one near where Alfred disappeared about 500 feet up on a seemingly inaccessible rocky outcropping where the bloodhounds had taken a scent to, and then it vanished. And then 6 miles away, you have another sighting of a boy that matches Alfred's description, that's another 500 feet up on a rocky outcropping that's seemingly inaccessible to a child. And that's all we have. Alfred was never found. In August of 1897, 2 parents and their 6-year-old daughter named Lillian went berry picking in Maine. The section of Maine they were in was only 15 miles away from the Canadian border, and it was very, very densely forested. At some point, the parents noticed that Lillian wasn't with them anymore. They assumed she must have wandered a couple feet away. Maybe she was behind a tree. But after an hour of searching, where they can't believe they're not seeing any trace of their daughter. I mean, they're in the middle of nowhere where if you yell out, someone's going to hear you, but there was no response from their daughter. They can't find her anywhere, so they alert authorities. Hundreds and hundreds of people came out for this search. The family is distraught. They're offering these huge rewards for any information about their daughter. You have all these very experienced outdoorsmen and huntsmen that are going out and looking for this girl. There is nothing. She has vanished completely. During this whole ordeal, friends and family would stay out in the woods overnight. They would just stay out there yelling and calling for Lillian, and she never turned up. About 48 hours after Lillian disappeared, there was a group of people searching an area about 2 to 3 miles away from where Lillian had gone missing. And Lillian just walks out from behind a tree, perfectly calm, doesn't look harmed, and she's just asking for her mother. There's this amazing reunion. It's a miracle that she's been found. I mean, this is 2 days that she's been missing in the middle of rural northern Maine. I mean, anything could have happened to her, but she's here, she's alive. When they asked the girl, what happened? Where'd you go? Why did you walk away? Like, what happened? She said something that piqued David Paulides' interest, and this is why this became a part of the Missing 411 project. She said, the sun shined all the time in the woods. The problem with that is while she was missing, it was overcast, dark, dreary, and she was in a very dense forest where there was, even if it really had been a very sunny day, you're not getting much sunlight coming down to the forest floor. So why would she describe something as being sunny the whole time in the woods when in reality, there was almost no sunlight? She also claimed that over the 2 days she was missing, she heard people talking around where she was, but she said that she needed to stay quiet because of the tramps that would be upset if she made any sound. It's just a very strange story, and like every other missing 411 case, there really isn't a good, rational explanation for why it happened. While David Paulides does not come out and say explicitly what he believes is behind all these strange occurrences inside of these missing persons cases, the insinuation or implication of his research is that something paranormal is behind it. So I'd like to hear what you think is behind some of these strange disappearances. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, I would encourage you to gently mule kick the like button and subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads on content that sounds an awful lot like what you just listened to in today's video. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message. On the night of March 2nd, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Pucheta rode his motorcycle down a dirt road in rural Argentina. It was pitch black out with no streetlights, and on either side of the road were mostly open fields, interspersed with patches of forest, and there were mountains rising up in the background. There was nobody around him for miles. This was an area called La Pampa, and it was famous for its beautiful landscapes and cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers, who came out here at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and birds that often sold for lots of money on the black market. It had been a quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something illegal. At around 10 p.m., Sergio was riding down the road towards a crossroads that locals called El Cruce de las Cañas, and up ahead, he saw the red taillights of a car. And at first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop,
But then it turned off the road and drove into this nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field, and then these taillights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. Maybe, he thought, this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide from Sergio. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and he parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out, it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he didn't bother to take it out because he didn't want to give away his position. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this vegetation the car had gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. I mean, the entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact. And so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this road, looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he couldn't find any. Like there was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation. And so eventually, Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange chirring sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he couldn't just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. So he took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glint in the darkness. And for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought, that's got to be the car. I've caught them. They're right here. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring, so terrifying that for a second, he just stood there frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him, so he opened his phone and said hello. But Sergio didn't say hello back. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Cañas. You know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, what's going on here, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio didn't answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio. And so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too. Because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him. Every time they had tried to call him back, he wasn't answering. Meanwhile, the backup, 3 police cars full of officers, sped past cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas, where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, like his actual location, they found his motorcycle, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle, and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again they were met with silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down, looking for any sign of Sergio. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, "Over here!" Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought, okay, well, maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger until finally the gap from one step to the next was 10 feet apart, then 15 feet apart, and then 20 feet apart. I mean, even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance to cover. I mean, this was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear. There was no mistaking this was a human footprint. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints. But now they just walked in silence. For more than 1 mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and trees until they arrived at a cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour at around 2 a.m. But the officers never gave up. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police couldn't find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and he saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball, and he was sitting in the mud. Now, keep in mind, this area is like in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through the area, and so to see anybody was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so, feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man, but didn't get a response, and so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped around him, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer couldn't see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining, and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet, this man was totally dry. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Sir, are you okay?" But the officer didn't react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It didn't take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Pucheta. But Sergio wouldn't talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He didn't appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with him. So the officers called an ambulance and they summoned Sergio's boss to see if he could get Sergio to respond. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the ground, but still Sergio wouldn't speak. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back and he sat with him and then went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio didn't want anybody to touch him, and he was very anxious, and he kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have injuries. I mean, he figured he had likely been assaulted or kidnapped. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, As the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he'd been standing on a hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk. And here is the totally wild story that he told. At 10 p.m. the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he didn't. There was no car. There were no poachers. When he turned, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then before he could do anything, the eyes began to move closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes, these were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they didn't appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that's when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. But then suddenly he felt this intense pressure in his torso, and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever seemed to be in control of him, but he couldn't. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards, like his back is arched in this totally unnatural position, and he's marching out of the trees. And then as he's doing this, he watched helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone. And then he dialed the number of that officer, and then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend, "Come to Las Cañas, you know what to do." And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassemble it and drop the pieces on the ground. And then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures are just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he didn't hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky, and for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again, he was lifted back up. And this time, he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again, and again, and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they didn't stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield. And as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw were swaying corn stalks and darkness. And for a moment, he's thinking, maybe this is all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then, once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him are two red glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself. But it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also